Good morning. Welcome everybody and our show Seeing Through Animal Eyes. I am your host, Chiara Marrapodi. And this show entails that there's no question that animals feel, sense, and experience life. Seeing Through Animal Eyes is the life work of myself, and I will share and explore internal realities of animals as I've experienced them. Through this series, we're going to discover the richness of the natural world and learn to connect with animals in a much, much deeper way. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to my guest, Patrick Battuello. Patrick is the founder and president of Horseracing Wrongs. It's a 501c3 nonprofit committed to eradicating horse racing in the United States. They are the only organization in the country that is clearly and consistently working towards this end. Welcome, Patrick, and thank you for being on my show.
Thank you so much for having me, Chiara.
So let's start with the beginning. Patrick, what prompted you to begin at the Horse Racing Wrongs nonprofit? How did you come to that place?
Sure. So I come to this from an animal rights background. I was writing a blog for the local newspaper here in upstate New York, Albany area. And I was covering all the various animal related issues. And when I started researching for a post on horse racing, I found that there was a dearth of information out there, that there was no organization clearly and consistently, like you said in the introduction, working on this full time. And so I decided that the racehorses, just like the ringlet elephants and just like the SeaWorld orcas and factory farmed animals and fur animals, needed a voice. And so that's how I began. I do not have a horse background. I was not involved in horse racing beyond following the Triple Crown season as a sports fan growing up, because again, and we'll get into this, it is sold to us as a sport. And being a sports fan, I thought it was my duty to tune in to the Kentucky Derby every year and root on Seattle Slew and Affirmed. So that's how it came to be. It was really a void in the animal rights community that I decided to fill.
And you made some very important points. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to really express my gratitude to you and your organization, because as we've already said, there's not another organization that brings all of this to light. And by the time that we're finished with this episode, people are going to understand why. Mm-hmm. And I'm so pleased that you are bringing the voice of the racehorses, and we're able to do it on this platform together, because I think it's very important. And as part of all the episodes that I'm producing, we talk about things that are current from the horse or the animal's perspective. And that involves grounding it here in this reality and how we perceive them and how we treat them and how they're in our society, what's their role. So let's start from the beginning. Because horse racing really is viewed, like you said, as a place where people can either place a bet and make money, or people get dressed up and there's a competition for hats and let's get together. But we're looking at it from the horse perspective. And as we do that, we're doing this more from an animal-centric perspective. Usually horse racing is provided as entertainment and sport, like you said, from a human-centric perspective. And so the horses really are the key to this, because without them, there wouldn't be horse racing. Number one. And number two, we don't actually know what happens in the background. We're never told what goes on in the background. Now, you and I know exactly what that's like, because I actually adopted an off-the-track thoroughbred. Her name is Miss Saskia, and she had PTSD and she had a brain injury. So it was a very, very difficult first few years using an integrated approach, which I published the research for, to be able to rehabilitate her. And she's a totally different being. She still has some PTSD from her track days, but she's at peace. So let's talk about the beginning. How does it all start for a foal who is destined to be on the track?
Sure. So they're bred by the thousands every year here in America, all searching for the next champion racehorse. So it starts with fundamentally commodification. These animals are commodified from birth. When I talk about a horse's birthday, I say the horse was made on whatever date that is, because that's what's happening. This is it's all forced breeding. So they are forcibly separated from their mothers, from their herd mates, at a very young age, usually before their first birthday. They are thrust into intensive training at the tender age of 18 months, which on the maturation chart is the rough equivalent of a 5 or 6 year old child.
And so let's stop there
So,
because that's an
sure,
important piece. And what I also want to bring up, if I may, Patrick, is that a lot of the times when they're born, they're sometimes taken away from their mothers, the dams, and they're
sure.
given to another mare, a draft usually because they're large, who can take two foals, who's a nurse mare, and
Nurse
whose
mare, right?
whose foal is thrown away. And we have other non-profits that actually take these little foals in, otherwise they die. So,
Sure.
it's
It's all part of the commodification. So yes, you have, and it's a highly specialized industry, just like with factory farming. You have your broiler chickens and your egg laying hens, and everything is very specialized. And it's the same thing with horse racing. So they do have these nurse mares who their only duty is to nurse foals of another horse. And so that other mare that gave birth can then be impregnated again and produce another foal. It's all about production. Again, it's commodification in a nutshell. So, getting back to, that intensive training. So a typical horse would not fully mature until the age of 6. His
correct.
bones aren't done growing. His plates aren't done fusing until 6. These horses are being thrust into intensive training at 18 months with an eye toward racing them at 2. They're babies. They
They are
still have their
babies.
baby teeth, in fact.
They do. And
Right.
if we look from a psychological and emotional perspective, there's no way that a foal is able to actually understand, take in, and assimilate and integrate, in other words, digest what's happening in their lives. And because they do have an internal reality, and
Sure.
it's impossible for, I mean, if we look at children, for example, they're unable to cognitively comprehend, certain things when they're young. And I understand that the horse brain is different to the child brain, but in
Mm.
terms of an analogy of not being able to digest an emotion, not being able to digest an experience, it's still the same. That is
It's
the
really
same.
not that much different, if I may.
Okay, please.
There are studies that have shown that dogs are the rough intellectual, mental equivalent of a 2 or 3 year old child.
I believe it.
Horses aren't, that much different than dogs. So the same could be applied there. So we're not talking, that much of a
To,
difference between
right.
a toddler and these animals and horses specifically. So yes, of course, they are fully sentient and intelligent, sensitive, feeling
Absolutely.
beings. And, to be forcibly again removed from their mother, from their herd, and thrust into this entirely different environment where now they are just, a means to an end, an asset to
Yes.
be used. It has to be terrifying. Of course, we're often accused of being anthropomorphic,
Yes.
applying human feelings, to animals. But all you need do is be around a horse or a dog or any other animal, and you can see in their eyes,
Yes.
terror
Well, I
and
can tell
fear.
you when I first adopted my Saskia, and she chose her own name. She was named something else, and I asked her, "Do you want this name?" And she said, "No, my name is Miss Saskia." And I'm like, "What type of name is that?" It means Valley of Light,
Hmm.
interestingly. And I mean, it looked to me like she was not in her body. She was dissociated.
Hmm.
And you couldn't touch her. Everything was very, very high. She was in hypervigilance all the
Hmm.
time. And, she had an ulcer, and this is not unusual for racehorses in particular because the resources that they have are limited. They try and keep them a
Hmm.
certain weight. They want them to be light on their feet. And the regimen is usually based on a certain amount in the morning and night. However, the horse stomach secretes acid 24/7. They're grazers and they trickle feeders. So already right there, not just the stress, but the lack of resources creates a conglomeration and a cluster that really lend itself to injury. And,
Sure.
incidentally, scientific research shows that zebras that are in captivity, the only time that they get ulcers is when they're transported.
Hmm.
Otherwise, they don't have that, doesn't exist in the
Sure.
reality of a wild equid, So when we do things, what I think is really important of what we're saying is that it's it really is a commodization, as you said, but at the same time, it's the way that we allow this to continue by supporting such um, things that we're not maybe fully aware of in the background, and
I think the problem, Chiara, is that people just haven't thought about this
yes,
deeply enough.
yes,
Again, goes back to this has been sold to us as a sport for over 150 years.
yes.
Secretariat was named by ESPN the 35th greatest athlete of the 20th century.
But he never chose to
Horse
do
racing,
that. He didn't
yeah,
choose.
horse racing was on the cover of Sports Illustrated 46 times in that magazine's first 30 years.
Yes,
So as we, as we grow, as Americans, in fact, worldwide,
yes,
we are conditioned to look at this as a sport and
yes,
to look at the racehorses as athletes. So it's a matter of reconditioning the public, and that's what our job is as advocates, is to get people to think about this, to step
yes,
back and say, well, what's happening here? Not only are, the way the horses are kept, and we can get into that more, but watching horses being whipped to race,
yes.
in and of itself is terribly abusive.
It is,
But
and
because it's been done for a century or more,
it,
people don't give it a second thought. And so it's our job to get the public, the media, the public, to reassess. And we're
yes,
confident that if they do, they'll see it through our eyes, and that this is animal exploitation and it's animal cruelty,
yes.
and it must end.
Yes, I mean, going back to the whip, for example, I know absolutely when I'm with my Saskia, I don't really have to do anything. I just use my
Mm,
finger and I say to her, back up a little bit for me very gently, and she does it. You
sure.
don't need a lot, and there's research to show that the upper epidermis of a horse is much thinner than a human. And so
Sure.
they feel a fly
Absolutely.
on their fur, and they you can see them when they're irritated by it. They'll swish their tail or they'll move that muscle. So you can imagine if you're using a whip,
Hmm.
and it's based on fear. Let's be honest. It's
Absolutely.
based on fear, and you can see it in their eyes. I mean, Saskia was so, it looked like she couldn't be at peace. No one could touch her. She was in such high alert. Her body was in pain. Literally,
Right.
her body was in pain until I came along, and she chose me actually, as they do. And from that moment, my whole role for her was to get her back to a place where she could be horse. What
Sure.
does that mean? She didn't even know what that meant. We would put her in a round pen, not to work her or anything, just to let her be,
Mm.
because she was in a boarding facility at the time, and she didn't know what to do. So just stood there. So
Yep.
I would have to go there and let's walk around, let's forage, let's look at this, let's sniff this. That's what horse does, and she didn't know what to do.
Right.
That's
Speaking of whips, for years, for decades, we were told that it's but a harmless guide, and that they're
yes,
responding more to the snap rather than the actual feel. And of course, that's nonsense. Of course, a rational person would see, and like you mentioned, horses are even more sensitive.
much more.
The horse's skin is even more sensitive than a human's. A couple of years back, Dr. Rick Arthur, who is the equine medical director of the California Horse Racing Board and is no, animal rights activist. In fact, I would term him an apologist for the racing industry. He admitted at a conference that the whip is a noxious stimulus. and that it motivates horses through pain and fear.
Yes.
So here we have, a key racing insider admitting what we have all known for forever,
Right.
that of course it's pain and fear, and that's how we motivate horses to race. So this talk of horses being born to run and love to run and they love to compete. Well, then, why do they need a human being perched top,
Yes.
whipping them?
Yes.
To get them to race. So of course it's nonsense. But these are the things that we need to work through with the public. We need them to see. And I always use this analogy. If you saw someone whipping his dog in the park, you would immediately call 911, and that man would be arrested.
Yes.
Now, because animal cruelty statutes are generally weak, nothing would probably happen more than just a fine. But the point is, you have two animals. One would, if you were to whip him, would be, you'd be arrested. And at the racetrack, of course, it happens in full public view, and it's just considered business as usual. So that's just one of the many sordid aspects of this industry. I do want to go back to the confinement and the isolation, because you talk about, horses being allowed to be horses. There is nothing worse than the confinement, in my estimation. The horses dying on the track.
Yes.
Most of them end up at the slaughterhouse, and
Yes.
it's horrific, of course. But it's that day in and day out cruelty of confinement, the negation of everything that makes them a horse. And that's why we see these horses exhibiting the same stereotypies that the ringlet elephants exhibited, and the SeaWorld orcas.
Yes.
And, factory farmed animals who are, penned up.
Yes.
The bobbing and the weaving and the swaying, and for horses, the cribbing, the air sucking, the incessant kicking, and even self-mutilation.
Yes.
These are clear, unequivocal signs of mental and emotional anguish. It's suffering that it's almost hard to fathom. And so when you talk about almost deprogramming your horse,
Absolutely.
once she came off the track,
She did.
that's exactly and I hear that time and again from people who have rescued horses from the racing industry. All these behaviors, they have to reprogram, and it's heartrending, in a word.
It was, I have to tell you. She was actually at the feedlot when she was rescued. So I came later when she was rescued by a rescue, but she was going to the slaughterhouse. And she's beautiful. She is just the most amazing animal I've ever had the honor of having in my life. She's taught me so much about horses, about PTSD in animals.
Yeah.
And she's the one that brought me much, much closer to creating the Society for Animal Consciousness, that we could really
Sure.
say, animals have sentience. We can't, it's like incarceration. If you have a human incarcerated, isolation is the worst possible place to be. That is the worst punishment.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm sorry to interrupt,
Please.
but Dr. Nicholas Dodman, he's on our advisory board. He's a retired Tufts professor with a specialty in animal behavior. He's world renowned. He's testified, numerous animal cruelty cases over the years. My first conversation with him about horse racing, he didn't talk about the on-track kills. He didn't talk about drugs. He didn't talk about slaughter, whips, all that's terrible, of course. He talked about the confinement.
Yes.
And that was the worst of it for him. And it made me feel good because it validated my feelings. But because I'm not an expert on this, because I don't have a horse background, it's something that I just intuitively knew that, keeping any animal, not just horses,
Yes.
penned up like that is
Absolutely.
wrong. But to hear an expert validate that was awfully reassuring to me. When we talked further, he said the best way he could describe it is to liken it to what human beings suffer in solitary confinement, confinement in prisons. And he read an article about a man who spent years in solitary, and his experiences and what he went through, and the trauma that he experienced. And he said that's what's happening to these horses.
Absolutely. They come off the track and they don't know if they're coming or going. You know, when you look at a thoroughbred, they're really labeled as a very hot horse, a horse that, you know, is prone to this. They don't have a choice. No one's listening to them.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first thing that Saskia, when she chose me, she knew I would listen. And she was
Mm-hmm.
lucky because I did. You
Yeah.
know, I could feel her. So, you know, as an empath, I could feel what was going on inside of her. And as soon as I adopted her, after a few weeks, she totally let go. So her
Mm.
personality dropped. She showed me she had an ulcer. She, you know, had lost a foal, so we had to work with that too. That was a huge trauma for her. So removing, I know we're backing up a little bit, but because this came up again, removing a foal from their dam or their mother so soon is damaging. If you had to
Horse.
remove a child, an infant, they would have abandonment problems, they would have problems with attachment. And you know, I saw similar, not exactly the same, but very similar things in Saskia because I did a degree in psychology, so I was interested in
Mm-hmm.
attachment. Imitation was one of the things I studied. So, um, you know, I saw this in her. And I actually used some of the polyvagal ideology and theory about bringing her back from being in that heightened hypervigilant state into a state where she's safe. The most important
Mm.
thing that she needed was safety.
Safety,
And
security, of
security and
course.
safety. And that's the herd. That's
Yeah.
the
And,
affiliate.
you know, it's bad enough to remove that foal from his mother, family, herd mates,
Yes.
but made worse with what they do to him after the industry gets a hold of him. And that's
Yes.
sticking him in a 12 by 12 stall for over 23 hours a day by
Yes.
himself.
Yes.
We're talking about naturally social herd animals that thrive on interacting with other horses, and they're not allowed to do that. It's
And
that negation again. That's
it
the
is.
worst of it, the worst cruelty in the horse racing industry.
And you know, I'm glad that you brought that up because throughout the show, I'm actually going to have an expert on wild horses come to talk about the wild
Mm-hmm.
ones. And we're going to go into that much more deeply because
Mm-hmm.
it really relates back to what your organization is doing, what I'm trying to do through Saskia and the society and the animal communication to bring the perspective of the animal and the reality of the animal to the fore so that people can have a wider, more global understanding and a more global centric, actually, not just
Mm.
animal centric, but you know, where is our
Sure.
place? Where is the place of the animal? How are we as guardians? Because we are their guardians, no doubt. And if we've brought them into this world by breeding, then we have a responsibility to,
Right.
you know, to ensure their safety. And if we can't, then we shouldn't be breeding them and should not be having this at all. And I think that's the bottom line.
Absolutely.
You
Absolutely.
know,
And you know that getting back to the confinement. So I testified before the New York State Senate in 2019, and a prominent New York equine vet also testified that day, and he said that keeping a horse locked up like that would be akin to keeping a child in a four
yes,
by four closet for 23 hours a day.
yes. Now
So when I
that's
say it, they could
abuse.
dismiss me and say that
Yes.
I'm sentimental, you know, overly sensitive, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But here we have, again, an expert, an equine vet, saying, yeah, that's like keeping a child. If that doesn't bring it home for people, I'm not sure what will. And there's an organization in America called Grade 2K. They've been the foremost movers behind getting greyhound racing all but eliminated
Yes.
in this country.
Yes.
They were telling us that ahead of that historic vote in Florida in 2018, there were 11 tracks left in Florida at the time, and there was a referendum vote, and it went over 2-1 to ban greyhound racing, which in Florida, as you know, politically is usually deadlocked at 50-50. So that was a monumental win. But they were saying that they did some polling ahead of the vote. And what they found, to their surprise, was that the single most powerful issue, you know, for the public was not the on-track deaths, and at the time, one dog was dying every 3 days on a Florida track, but the confinement, keeping the dogs in cages for 23 hours a day. So we have the same issue in horse racing, but unfortunately, there's two things working against us. One, most people don't have interactions, one-on-one interactions with horses,
Yes.
where I think over the course of our lifetimes, most people have been around dogs, if not in their own homes, at least been around other people's
You're
dogs.
right.
But in addition, we keep dogs in the house. We keep horses in stables. So
Right.
people are used to seeing horses stalled like that. And so it's hard for them to understand this exact same thing is
Yes.
happening.
Yes.
That's what's happening to the dogs in those cages. So we need, it comes down to educating again,
It
getting
does.
people to understand that they're suffering the same exact way that the dogs were.
They are, and I mean, you can see it. They try and run away. They kick out.
Mm-hmm.
They even rear up at the gates. They flip
Right,
over. My Saskia flipped over. She has a vertebrae that's not, now it's much better
right.
because of the support we've given her, but she flipped over and
Mm-hmm.
they can die. And let's
Yeah.
talk about that in terms of the training and then the breaking of legs, I mean, and the injury. And I mean, at 4 years old, I mean, even at 3 or 2, they are basically done. Their career is done because
Sure.
they can't do anymore and they've been pushed and they've been supported through numbing the pain and pushing
Yeah.
through it. But in that case, you get broken bones, you get tendons that bow, you have all sorts of
Sure.
repercussions.
So, for the average person out there, if I were to talk about horse racing, and I would say, well, what do you think what are the problems with horse racing? Most people would say drugs, because that's all they hear about. Drugs, drugs, drugs. And hence the Horse Racing Integrity Act, which is going to be going into effect next year.
Oh, good.
Drugs are a part of the story, but they're not the most significant part of the story. And the best way I can explain that is I get varying degree of detail from the state racing commissions throughout the country. The ones who give me full necropsy reports on the dead horses, time and again, I see 2, 3, 4-year-old horses, still pubescents,
Yes.
that are dying with chronic osteoarthritis,
Yes.
degenerative joint disease in all 4 fetlocks. Again, we're talking about pubescence. I sometimes get that notification on horses who have never been raced. They broke down while training. So this speaks to that grinding of unformed bodies. So when I talk about the inevitability of dead racehorses, this is primarily what I'm talking about. They're bred for speed, but also they're first put to work long before their bodies are mature.
Yes.
And then they're constant grinding. It's just putting on the track, that hard training.
Absolutely.
At that same Senate testimony, that veterinarian talked about, putting these young bodies to work. And one of the senators asked him, well, yes, but we put our children in Little League and gymnastics. What's the difference? And he goes, these horses are being put right at the Super Bowl level.
Correct.
The perfect answer.
Perfect
It's that
answer.
intensive, hard training, because again, we go back to the commodification. They are assets. They are not going to wait for these horses to be, fully mature, 5
Right.
or 6 years old. They are not going to bring them along slowly. It costs money to keep these horses. They have to get them into a race at the age of 2.
Yes.
And so hence the training at 18 months. So it's that grinding, and that's why we
And
see
let me
those
tell
bodies
you-
are so badly damaged.
Yes, and let me tell you that I've actually heard people say to me, Chiara, we can't actually let that horse in the pasture because if it injures itself, it's too costly. That horse
Of
is
course.
over $100,000 and more.
Right.
So if
That's
we
why
put it
they
in
keep this
pasture, they're
sold
going to
up.
be a horse. They're going to kick
Right.
each other. They're going to bite each other because, they're not a herd that's
Of
a
course.
familial herd that's lived together. So we see behaviors that are not typical of horses, and they're
Yep.
mistaken as horse behavior, or the horse is being naughty. That is not true, because we're putting horses together that don't know each other. It's not.
Sure.
We're going to start to see a pecking order because of that fact. Whereas in the
Right.
wild, as a family, they know who the stallion is, who the dams are. So can you imagine?
It's the same thing as the elephants. Remember, Ringling Brothers, and they kept them chained up, and
Yes.
they would sway back and forth. I mean, you know how
Yes.
intelligent, elephants are.
Yes.
They were suffering. It's so heartrending to think about these animals and how they suffer for years. So we talk about the deaths, the on-track deaths, and I'd like to get into that if we could.
Yes,
But
please.
and of course, slaughter is a huge
It's a
part of
huge problem.
this story. But it's that day in and day out
Yes.
cruelty, that suffering. And you talked about how you brought along your horse, and eventually she came to trust you. It's amazing what kindness and
She
gentleness
is
does.
amazing. The other day, I went to see her with my a friend of mine, and I said, "Who's your human?" And she moved to my friend because my friend comes along with me a lot, and tapped my friend. And then I said, "Who's your second human?" And she came to me and she gave me a kiss on my cheek, and that just blew my heart wide open. I was like,
Of
"Oh
course.
my goodness!"
Yeah.
And I look at her and I think, thank you,
Thank you.
because
Yeah.
you were dealt a really bad card until 7 years old. You were going to the slaughterhouse, and yet look at you today. You
Right.
trust me. I am
Hmm.
part of humanity, right?
Right.
But you still trust me. She's in your pocket mare. She follows you around like a
Mm.
puppy. It's kind of
And we
sweet.
see the same thing with dogs, right? That come from terribly abusive situations. They
Yes.
come from puppy mills, and you show them love and affection, and as you said, safety, security, and they will turn it around. And that's, but again, it's heartrending that human beings can treat animals in this way,
I
and that's what
think
the horse racing industry is. It's just a business.
that's what I
These
was going to
people are in
say.
it just to make money.
Yes, that's the difference. And
Hmm.
it's not just giving them love, I feel, from what I learned with Saskia and all the animals I've had all my life. I grew up in Africa, so I've had a lot of animals in my
Hmm.
life. Um, but what I realized is giving them species specific resources. Do they need space? Do they need food? What type of food is their body designed for? For example, cats are carnivores. It's my duty as a cat, I can't own an animal, even though by law I own
Guardian.
her. But I
Yeah.
just, from a soul perspective, we chose each other. But it's
Right.
as a guardian, yes,
Yeah.
it's my duty to give them what they need to the best of my ability, which I do. And I think that's also a key factor. And when the animals realize that, they show you a side of them that is just beyond description for me to explain to you and to everyone who's listening to this, the beauty and the pure. And it's not, I don't like to use unconditional love because I think it's overused, but it's a purity. There is a
Hmm.
purity that's shared and an adoration because they see that you see them. And this is why
Right.
this episode, this episode is important and the series is important because we want to see them for them. And that's
Right.
the greatest gift we can give to each other and the animals, is to see
Right.
each other for who we are
Right.
without projecting our ideas, what's been done in the past, the value that they have. These are all human projections, and I actually think that's much more anthropomorphic than anything that we've done in terms of sentience right here
Mm.
today.
Hmm.
But let's talk a little bit more about, I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about the drugs in the industry and injury. And
Sure.
we'll
Not
continue
not
from
as
there.
much the drugs.
Go.
The drugs. This is where they come into play. So we talked about those chronic conditions that these
Yes,
horses are dying with. So that's why drugs are a factor,
yes,
because they have to keep them on the track.
correct.
They have to get a certain number of races out of them, a certain number of dollars out of them, and that's how they do it, by injecting them with pain numbing, injury masking chemicals. So yes, it's a part of the story, but it's only one of many facets. Collectively the wrongs of horse racing. But getting back to the killing, uh, before we came on the scene, no one knew how many horses were dying on American tracks. People were certainly aware. I mean, if you followed the Kentucky Derby or the Triple Crown races, you knew about 8 bells breaking down, and she broke both of her legs at the wire. You know about Barbaro a couple years prior to that. So people were aware that occasionally, yes, it's a shame a horse breaks down on the track, but no one knew the scale until we came along. So that's what we did. We, through FOIA requests, so all of our information comes from the industry itself. It was really important for me as a very fact-based person that I had, facts to fight this multi-billion-dollar industry with. I can't just go out and say that horse racing is animal abuse.
No.
It has to be more to that.
Yes.
And so I back it up with data. So over 2,000 horses are killed racing or training across America every year.
That's a lot.
Over 2,000. That's
Taking that
almost
in.
6 every single day.
6 every single day. That
Right.
is a travesty.
Right. And then that's just the on-track kills. Hundreds more are dying back in their stalls. And that's something that has also changed since we started reporting and talking about this issue. So when I first started and I would report on stall deaths, I would get the apologists who would come on and say, well, that's not fair. If a horse dies of colic back in his stall, how are you blaming that on the industry? Horses colic, can and do colic anywhere in all different kinds of environments. Well, first off, racehorses are at a higher risk of colic.
You got ulcers,
than,
number one.
Right, because of diet, because of confinement,
Yes.
because of mobilization, etc.
Yes.
And I've backed that up with studies on the website. But I always use an historical analogy. I'm a big history buff, and I was taught that 650,000 some odd soldiers died during the American Civil War. Most people don't know that 2/3 died of disease.
Interesting.
Yet we've never had an historian come on and try to draw a distinction between a soldier who died of dysentery and a soldier who died of a gunshot wound on the battlefield. It would be absurd to do something like that. If not for the war, those soldiers would not have been in those camps, passing along, disease to each other and dying in huge numbers. Same thing with stall deaths. And so, because of our message discipline, because we have been talking about this and drawing an unequivocal line from the very beginning that a stall death is the same as a track death.
Yes, it is.
Now media is reporting stall deaths. In fact, the Philadelphia Inquirer just did a report on a track in Philly called Parks. They've had 31 deaths in the first 6 months of the year. They're on a pace for over 60 at one track. They did not, break it down between racing, training, and stall deaths. It was just 31 deaths. And that is, largely due to the work that we've done at Horse Racing Wrongs. So over 2,000 dying on the track, hundreds more dying back in their stalls. It's also important that people understand that it's more than just a broken leg that fells these horses.
Yes,
people are under the impression that, okay, they break a leg and they're not good candidates, which is true. They're not good candidates for surgery, recovery like a human being would be.
Yes.
And so it's a shame they have to euthanize. It's humane thing to do. Well, first off, those breaks are horrific.
They are.
And again, go on our website. Just go to, I've got a category called How They Die, and it's just a snapshot of some of the various ways these horses are dying. And some of these broken legs, we're talking about shattered into multiple pieces, bones sticking through the skin,
and
blood.
This comes back down to what we were talking about initially, where they're being started way too soon. The bones are not fused. The body is not ready for this type of training, not mentally, not physically. Yes, this pounding. And, let's be honest, thoroughbreds have very, very spindle legs. They're bred that way, to have very thin legs. And
it's all about speed.
For speed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we also back up a little bit about deaths in the stall, well, think about it. If somebody's in isolation, do they want to eat? Do they even want to be alive? Do they want to have this experience? I know that it's controversial, but I have read some anecdotal information that, some dolphins decide to die in captivity. They hold their breath.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't be surprised.
How horrible is that to think?
To think that they have to resort to that.
Mm-hmm. And yes, you're right. And getting back to how the industry tries to deflect and distract, they come right out and say that they don't count any deaths, any euthanasias outside of a 72-hour window as a racing or training death. So, a horse could break his leg and maybe they're trying to, see if he'll be a candidate for surgery. If he's euthanized 4 days later after the break, that is not classified as a track-related death. And this is how they get around, some of these deaths. But in addition, a lot of times, if they're valuable enough, they will try to save them through surgery to keep them viable for stud
But
work.
now you have an injury, and inevitably that means that that might flare up again. So now
Absolutely,
and it's
there's
going to
long
be
term pain and
recurring.
suffering
Yes.
involved, right? But I don't know if you remember, Barbaro was another famous horse who broke down in 2006 at the Preakness. And because he was, a top flight horse, they tried to keep him alive. And he had to endure multiple surgeries. And ultimately, he succumbed to laminitis, which is a very
Oh,
painful
that is very
inflammatory
painful.
condition in the feet,
Yes.
maybe the most
Yes.
painful thing that a horse can experience.
Yes. Yes.
That was not classified as a track related death because it happened months later and it was laminitis. So they tried to again deflect from what's happening on the tracks. This is why these stall deaths are so important for people to understand that these are animals that are still very much in servitude to the racing industry. They're
Yes.
active racehorses in between
Yes.
races, dying of colic and laminitis. I often get reports of a horse being found dead in his stall, quote, found dead in his stall, just keeled over and died. Again, 3-4-year-old horses. Other ways that they die on the track beyond the broken limbs, they die of ruptured ligaments. They die of failed hearts, what are called cardiovascular collapse.
And what about the lungs?
The
They also
lungs,
bleed through the.
pulmonary hemorrhage, they bleed
Yes.
out from the lungs.
And on
They
that
die of
note,
broken necks, severed
I'm
spines.
not surprised.
It's horrific.
It
And again,
is.
so people need to
They
know
do.
this is how these animals are dying, these so-called athletes, on the track. And,
Yes.
I have a post on the website called The Big Lie, Horse Racing is Sport. And one of the things I talk about is that the horse is dying regularly on the playing field, and what other sport does that happen? And if by chance an athlete did die in a baseball game or a football game, by the way, I think in the basketball, football, hockey, and baseball, in their combined history of hundreds of years, 3 or 4 have actually died in
I
competition.
was going
And
to
here we
ask
are
you.
seeing that 6 are dying every single day.
Yes.
But think about that. What would happen if a baseball player had a heart attack on the field? Well, the game would be called. It would be
Exactly.
canceled, right?
Exactly.
Not in horse racing. They cart that horse off the track, whether he's euthanized on the track or back in the barn. But let's assume he's euthanized right there in the dirt. They drag him onto the van, and the rest of the day's festivities continue.
And
There's not even a momentary a moment of silence for the horse.
I agree with you. And
Disgusting.
it is. And on that note, I recently did an animal communication with a off the track thoroughbred called Mooney. Beautiful, beautiful boy. He was 4 years old. He's been retired because of a leg injury. And I have to tell you, it was the most amazing animal communication I've had. Because it was, apart from Saskia, I haven't really had the opportunity to do an animal communication with an off the track thoroughbred. And through her, I've learned everything. But he asked me, he said, Chiara, I need you to help me to make my heart coherent again because it's out. It's not coherent. And those are not the words he used, but it was a feeling, and it was because I'm an empath, I can feel things and I interpret them in English in the way we can understand.
Sure.
And so I said, okay, what do you need me to do? And, I thought perhaps we could do some coherent exercises with breathing. And he said, no, I want my heart to connect with your heart. And your heart is going to recalibrate mine to bring it back in coherence because it cannot be done any other way. And so I agreed, and it was the most... I can't even express to you in words what that felt like. It felt like there were 2 hearts together, and one was pulling on the other, and there was this oscillation between both of them, going from mine to his and his to mine. And it literally felt like a pulling of the heart, so I was being pulled forward. And when it was complete, he thanked me, and he asked for his mom, energetically, could you bring her in? I want to feel her again. But he needed that because his heart, like what you said, his heart was large, and the heart was not balanced, and he would not be here for much longer if it continued that way.
That's
Or he would have other
powerful,
problems.
powerful,
Really,
powerful.
really powerful. I sat there for a long time digesting that whole experience because I'm
Mm,
just a conduit, that's what I do.
mm,
And I'm here to support the animals and the humans to understand each other better. But
mm,
they're teaching me all the time.
mm.
And so that experience was the most profound experience I've ever had. But he had the same dissociation. That look
Yeah.
in his eye where he's not in the body, he's dissociated. It's too hard to be
Mm,
inside the body because it's too much pain, mentally,
mm,
emotionally, and physically. So that was a
mm,
very similar thing that I noticed.
mm. Wonderful.
So,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And if we have time, I'd like to talk about slaughter.
Please, let's do that. We do have
Yeah.
time because that was also Saski's story.
Right. So most spent or simply no longer wanted racehorses in America are shipped to slaughter.
Yes.
Most. It's hard to get a definitive number, but there have been only 2 studies that I know of that have actually tried to identify the breeds. And just a bit of background, currently there are no equine slaughterhouses on U.S. soil. The last one's closed in 2007. They haven't been outright banned, just defunded. There's no funding for USDA inspectors. So now we ship them to Canada and Mexico, which
Yes.
in and of itself is a horror
It is a horror.
because they're crammed into these trailers. The USDA says they can go up to 36 hours without food, water, or rest. At this point, they're just so many pounds of meat and waiting to be delivered to this horrific end. The slaughterhouse for horses is equine hell.
Yes,
In
it
short,
is.
it's equine
It
hell.
is.
Um, as a vegan, I maintain that all animal slaughter is wrong. But it's particularly horrific for flight animals like
Yes.
horses.
They can't get
So they
away.
get into these buildings and they are absolutely terrified.
I know.
The sights, sounds, and smells of death are all around them. They watch as the person or the person, the horse, they are persons,
Yes, the
the
animal
horse in
person.
front of them is forced into this what's called a kill box, and they are shot either with the 22 caliber rifle or a retractable metal bolt to the brain. But because these animals are prey animals and their instinct is to flee, it makes getting a clean shot difficult.
Difficult.
So often it takes multiple tries for the horse to be rendered either outright dead or unconscious. Sometimes, though, they are moved along while still conscious to the actual exsanguination, the cutting of the carotid artery and the bleed out. So it's horrific. It's violent. It's everything that you can possibly envision. And this is how most of the horses that are being cheered on at American racetracks today are ending. And so we're talking about multiple thousands. Our estimates are anywhere between 10 and 15,000 thoroughbreds alone. If you include standardbreds and quarter horses, it
Yes.
could be upward of 20,000 every year.
Yes.
Former racehorses
Yes.
going to this end, meeting this
And
end.
there's something that came to me, and it's something I've thought about quite a lot. When I got Saskia, I cried many, many tears for that horse because I couldn't experience the same thing as she did because I'm not in a horse body, but I have the capacity as an empath to connect enough with her that I could feel the feelings that she had. And so
Mm-hmm.
I cried many, many, many tears. And if there's something that she taught me, it's that we have a responsibility to say no. We have a responsibility to look at ourselves and the language that we use. We use a lot of violent language between ourselves with animals, and we use projections too, and we also employ. We ask people and animals to comply with things before asking them how they feel. What's their choice? Now, she chooses
Mm-hmm.
everything. She chooses her minerals, her herbs. She chooses everything because I wanted to give her self agency, something that she'd never had before.
Right.
And we have self agency to get up in the morning, to eat when we want to eat. They don't have self agency at all. They eat when it's given to them, even if they have an ulcer, no one's looking at them. They're still hungry, they're still secreting stomach acid. They don't get the food. because they can't
Right.
ask in a way that we can understand, and we're not allowing ourselves time to listen to them. And I think, at least for me, I think it's very important that we begin to listen to the animals and begin to listen to their stories, and all the stories that we've shared today and all the information that you've shared today. And I want to say that, I'm so glad Saskia was rescued. She's my
Yeah,
heart horse.
I am too.
I am so glad she was rescued,
Mm.
because the beauty, the purity, and the experience of being in her presence has been the greatest privilege of my life.
Mm.
So, now that we've talked about this some, what are some of the things that we can do to support celebration of thoroughbreds in a way that allows them to be seen? Because that's what I'm doing with Saskia, and I want people to know that that is a possibility. What can we do? What do you feel we could do?
Well, the most direct thing we can do to help thoroughbreds is to end the industry that
Yes,
exploits them, and
yes,
that'd be horse racing. So,
yes,
you can go to our website, horseracinkwrongs.org. We sponsor protests throughout the country. We have, we've had heavy billboard campaigns, especially during Triple Crown season. We are involved now in lobbying state legislatures to get rid of the subsidies that are keeping the bulk of the racing industry afloat.
yes,
And most people are unaware that, like here in New York, almost $250 million every year in corporate welfare is going to prop up the horse racing industry at the expense of school children. The money should be going back to the state to support education. So those are things that you could do. You could certainly write a letter to not only to the media, to letters to the editor, but also to your local politicians, the
okay,
governor. Um, we have to voice outrage. We have to let people know that this is wrong and the way we're treating horses is wrong.
yes,
So that's the most direct thing we can do to help thoroughbreds. Um, it is my feeling that the evil is in the domestication. So when we take an animal, we manufacture them and then we domesticate them. And you were
yes,
talking about agency. It's a perfect word. We
yes,
deny them, as a society. I mean, certainly you're giving,
yes,
your horse agency as much as
as
possible,
much as
but
possible.
because they've been domesticated, they are wholly dependent on us as human beings. And that, to me, is the fundamental wrong. We're taking away their natural autonomy
Yes,
by domesticating them, by making them dependent. And people like us, unfortunately, are in the minority. People
yes,
who connect with animals on that level.
yes.
Um, most people in society don't look at animals that way, and hence that's why we have all this abuse and cruelty
Yes.
involving not just horses but other domesticated
Lots of
animals.
other domestic animals. And I mean, I'm so glad, thank you, Patrick, for bringing that up, because it's a very, very important piece. And, domestication in and of itself is already a difficult thing for animals. This is what I've learned through the many years that I've been communicating with them. But they do so to support us to grow and evolve,
Mm-hmm.
and at great sacrifice, at
Right.
huge sacrifice, whether it's a cat, a dog, a reptile, or a
Mm-hmm.
horse. And really, I do feel that it's up to us to begin to rise up in terms of our evolution and to emancipate them of this burden.
Right.
Um, and it doesn't mean we can't have them in our lives, but do it in such a way to the best of one's ability, because obviously there is, when you have a large animal, it's not so easy, but to the best of one's ability to see them for who they are so that we can understand them from their perspective and without imposing what we want, whether they're an asset or not. And I want to say one last thing. I've heard so many people in that industry say, I love my horse. And I've had many discussions with many people who feel the same as us.
Mm-hmm.
That's not love. that's usually based on what you can do for me.
Right.
True love gives freedom. The freedom to
Absolutely.
be, the freedom to feel, the freedom to say no. How many times, my Saskia, when we go out, it's a co creation. We walk together. I don't ride her.
Mhm.
We walk together, but it's a co creation. And she'll
Right.
say she wants to go in this direction. She moves her head and neck in that direction. I'm like, no, Saskia, let's
Mhm.
go here first. Then we'll go there.
Mhm.
And we do. And she knows. And she will express herself using her body and feelings and other things that I can receive because she knows she'll be
Sure.
heard. She's free to the
Right.
best of my ability because anything in domestication can't be fully free.
Of
But
course. No,
we're
I
doing the best,
absolutely, and
you
I
know?
fully appreciate that because I do the same with my dog. I mean, try to give him as much freedom as possible
Yes.
with the understanding that he still is dependent on me. He still needs
Yes.
me to, set parameters and, and that for me is the fundamental wrong, you know.
It is for me too. And, it'll be interesting as this discussion evolves and we talk about the wild horses. Perhaps you can come back and we can discuss
Mm,
both of them
sure.
together and let's see how that pans out because I think that's a really important piece because we can see the difference. They do have self agency, they have
Right.
family,
Hmm.
and I'm going to have 2 episodes on that. So let's talk about that. I would really like
Absolutely. I'd
that.
love to.
Okay, that's
Uh,
fabulous. Well,
uh,
Patrick, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to be
uh,
on my show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
yes.
And thank you for sharing your knowledge. And thank you for creating Horse Racing Wrongs, for them to have a voice based on evidence, to support education of people worldwide so that they can understand that horse racing is not having a drink and wearing a party hat and your best
Mhm.
dress or placing a bet. These are beings on the other side of this that are sacrificing their body, minds, and souls, literally. So,
Right.
Patrick, how can people connect with you if they would like to? Please go ahead and tell us.
Sure. Horseracingwrongs.org. There is an about contact page at the top, and I'm very, very accessible. And I'd be glad to talk to people, on the phone. Um, I will talk about this issue anytime, any place with anyone. Very passionate about what I do,
Yes.
and I do feel like we are making progress, and that things are starting to shift. And I think that the industry senses that too. So we're heading in the right direction.
I'm so pleased to hear it. Saskia and I are so grateful. Well, Patrick, it was wonderful to speak to you.
Yes, same here. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
having me
so
on, Chiara.
much.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.